Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being here for Sharon Bala's personal essay workshop, Grappling with the Monster. I am not Sharon. My name is Elizabeth DeMariapi. I'm the executive director at Riddle Fence. Um, Riddle Fence, if you're not familiar with us, we are primarily a literary magazine. We're a beautiful, glossy literary magazine that also publishes visual art in full color. We are based here in St. John's on the island of Uktuunguk, the ancestral home of the Beothuk and Mi'kmaq people, also known as the island of Newfoundland. Um, Riddle Fence does a number of things that are all very exciting as far as I'm concerned. In addition to our print magazine, we also have a really fulsome digital presence. If Newfoundland and Labrador is also your home, you're going to find weekly arts reviews online at riddlefence.com. So reviews of Newfoundland and Labrador books, as well as any kind of performance or visual art show that is going on in the province. You may find a review there. We also do in-person events and workshops. We run a really interesting and exciting visiting writers program every year. And as of this year, we're running a new online workshop series. So this is only our second in our online workshop series,
Frig
which
sakes.
let's make sure that we're muted. Please make sure that you stay muted. You should be muted from the time you come in, and you don't want to unmute your audio so that Sharon can be heard. Our online workshop series is funded this year by the Cultural Economic Development Program of the government and Newfoundland and Labrador. That is what allows us to do it at this pay what you can rate and make it really accessible, which is our hope for the program. I am going to get to Sharon really quickly after I give you just a couple of little housekeeping notes. Housekeeping, as I said, upon entering the workshop, you are muted. You can unmute yourself, but we are asking that you don't do that until we get to a point in the workshop where sharing or questions are open. This video is being recorded, obviously for our records and for our funders. A portion of the video, the instructional portion only, may be shared at a later date. I don't want you to worry at all. When there is a time for you to be sharing or asking any questions, that part of the video will be edited out. So you can feel really secure that you can share your work and ask any questions you want to ask without feeling like it's going to be public. It's not going to be public. It's going to stay right here between us. However, if you want to turn your video off, if that makes you feel more comfortable, you can go ahead and do that, and that's fine. Q&A. Um, Please put your Q&A in the chat. I'm going to moderate the Q&A at the end to make sure that we don't have repeat questions and that we get to as many possible questions as we can. You should be able to turn your auto captioning on. I have it on my screen, so that means you should be able to turn it on if that's easier for you. And you can expect the runtime of this workshop to be a little over 2 hours. With that, I am going to turn to Sharon right now. We're so lucky to have Sharon here today. And I feel really lucky as executive director at Riddle Fence because Sharon joined our staff, I guess about a year ago now, and has really done a great job kind of renewing and making our nonfiction section much more exciting. Sharon Bala is the author of the novels Good Guys, which is brand new this year, and The Boat People. Her short fiction has won the Journey Prize and been published in literary magazines and anthologies across the country. Her nonfiction has appeared in the Globe and Mail, Maclean's, and elsewhere. Sharon is the creative nonfiction editor at Riddle Fence. I'm going to let you take it away, Sharon.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Welcome everyone to this workshop on writing personal essays, also called narrative essays or personal narratives. I'm going to be using those three terms interchangeably this afternoon, but essentially narrative essays are personal narratives, personal essays. They are one type of creative nonfiction. There are many types of creative nonfiction, but just for the purpose of this afternoon, I'm focusing on this particular one because right now at Riddle Fence, this is really what the creative nonfiction section is very hungry for. And so selfishly, I'm focusing this workshop on that. Okay. So before I begin any workshop, before I begin working with writers who are published in Riddle Fence, before I begin working with my private clients, I always like to give two caveats. The first is that there are no rules for good writing. Things that you have heard, like show, don't tell, or try not to begin a narrative with the narrator waking up in bed, those are handy guidelines, but they're guidelines only. And everything that I say today is really just a guideline. And guidelines can be helpful. They are really useful, I would say 75 to 95% of the time. And the rest of the time, you really want to ignore the guideline and do something completely different. Okay, with that out of the way, what is a personal essay? A personal essay is a true story I tell about myself. It is anecdotal, it is experiential, and it is personal. Those three words are important. The anecdote is the event, what happened. And the experience is important too. That's the feelings, the emotions, the narrator's interiority. The reader needs to experience the event as if it is happening to them. And then finally, personal. That's the first person perspective in your essay. That's the I, the me in the story. Personal essays are intimate, they are vulnerable. For the reader to experience the anecdote as if they are me, I must be part of the essay. With an academic essay, the goal is to educate. And with journalism, the goal is to uncover the truth. When you're writing a narrative essay, you might also be educating and uncovering the truth. But the added thing that you are doing that's really important in creative nonfiction is the entertainment part, which is to say you are trying to amuse or be enjoyable for the reader. Even if the subject is difficult, even if you're going to a very dark place and the work is sad, the essay itself must capture and hold the reader's attention. And so when you're thinking about entertaining, what you're really thinking about is not just amusing the reader or tickling their fancy. You're really thinking about holding and capturing their attention. A personal narrative is not a journal entry, although a journal entry is a really good place to begin often, and you can take the material in a journal entry and shape it into a narrative essay using the tools of literature. It is also not an op-ed, although your opinion, the opinion of that first-person narrator, is important. That's the personal and the experiential. What happened to you? What hurt? What meaning can you make out of it? It's also not an academic essay, although you can place a first-person narrative within a larger context and weave a thoughtful exploration of a subject with your own personal history. That's a more complicated type of creative nonfiction. It's a more complicated type of essay, and it's outside the scope of this workshop. But if you have questions about that kind of an essay, do feel free to save them for the end of the workshop when I'll be taking Q&A. And if you're interested in reading or writing this kind of a more complicated essay, we have a really wonderful one coming in issue 57 of Riddle Fence, which is coming out in early June. The essay is called 17 Seconds. And in it, the author, who's a Newfoundland author, he takes a viral YouTube video and kind of unpacks this viral YouTube video and then puts it in the context of, or uses it as a jumping off point into an exploration of the performance of identity and then his own complicated feelings about his identity as a Newfoundlander, as the child of an immigrant, as someone who, when he goes to the mainland, is treated as the other. And so there's that really personal grappling that happens in the essay, but it's set in this larger context of looking at identity. So the wonderful thing with creative nonfiction that makes it different from what I call straight nonfiction is that we have all the tools of literary writing at our disposal when we're crafting our personal essays. Some of those tools include time travel. So these are flashbacks and flash forwards. Um, Also, another thing that you can do is that you can braid two time periods together in a single essay. So, for example, if you wanted to tell a story of a road trip that you took last year, that can be one strand of narrative. And then you can weave that together, perhaps, with the story of when you were 16 and a parent taught you how to drive. And you can weave those two narratives together into a single one. Tense is also one of the tools at your disposal. So, for example, you can tell a past tense story using the present tense. You can jump forward into an imagined future, and you can do that in past tense, in present tense, in future tense. Scenery and setting, of course, are very important tools that you have. Descriptions of place and time can really help situate the reader in the narrative. If you remember what I said a few slides ago about the importance of the experiential, letting the reader experience the anecdote as it happened to you, the first person narrator. So using really evocative scenery can help you do that. And then story arc. This is where, for example, you might take the journal entry and then craft the story, the kind of narrative in such a way using story arc. And that is about where you choose to begin the essay and where you choose to end. What change has taken place for the narrator, for you as the narrator, and for the reader between those 2 points? What are the epiphanies that have happened? Earlier this week, I was reading something unrelated, and I came across this line about writing, and I thought I wanted to weave it into this workshop. So I'm going to read it now, and I'm going to keep referring back to it. Strong writing is alive on the page and a voyage of discovery. So that sounds very fancy, and it's a little bit like, what does it mean to have writing that is alive on the page? For me, this is where the experiential comes in, right? Where the scenery and the setting is so well done that the reader can really experience the anecdote with you. But then being alive on the page can also be things like voice. And then the journey of discovery, this is what I'm trying to get at with this talk of where is the change? What has changed for you, the narrator, between where you begin the essay and where you end, where you begin the narrative and where you end? And then foreshadowing. So maybe foreshadowing is something that you only think about when you think about fiction, but I think it can be a really powerful tool when you are writing creative nonfiction. Think about all of the times that you felt serendipity in your life, or you had a feeling of déjà vu. When you are crafting your narrative, think about the moments of repetition in your own life or patterns that you notice. You know, things that your grandmother said to you that you didn't really pay attention to, that then come back to you at a crucial moment later, or an experience that your parents had that you find yourself now as a parent unexpectedly reliving. Those kinds of things, if you notice them in your day-to-day life, you can bring that insight of repetition, um, of pattern repetition, of serendipity, of déjà vu, of foreshadowing to the page as well. And then, of course, anytime you are telling a story, there are going to be characters. If nothing else, you as the narrator, as the first person I, are a character in this narrative. And often when there are characters, they speak, and that speech is dialogue. And so that is another tool you have at your disposal, where you choose to have dialogue that is direct or share it in a summary way or in an indirect way. Those are conscious choices that you make when you are crafting your narrative essay. I mentioned insight a moment ago, and I'm going to talk about it a little bit more in the next few slides, and similarly, prose. So you have all of these tools at your disposal when you are writing your narrative essay. And these tools will help you to not be boring. Boring is the death knell for any type of writing. And in nonfiction, it is especially easy to fall into the trap of boring the reader to sleep. So what is the opposite of boring? The opposite of boring is compelling writing, that writing that is alive on the page. Writing that is interesting, that is gripping, that is entertaining for the reader. There are different ways to do this, and one is with strong prose. So that might be poetry in motion, beautiful sentences that demand to be read aloud. It could be startling metaphors that make the reader stop in their tracks and think. It could be comedy. It could be a unique voice. But strong writing can also be spare, unfussy prose. And so my one piece of advice with this is to not try too hard when you're writing, because sometimes I find if we're trying too hard, if we're too much in our heads thinking, I really want this writing to be absolutely beautiful, what can happen is you do the opposite, that the prose becomes purple and the writing becomes overwrought. The sort of best way, if you are an emerging writer and you're trying to find your voice, I think, is to read really widely, not just creative nonfiction, but fiction and poetry and everything you can get your hands on, and then write a lot. Just keep practicing. And then I think that without really noticing it, you will develop your own unique voice. The other way to have gripping, interesting writing is to have insight. So if you are revealing startling truths to the reader in your essay, if you are drawing unexpected connections for them, if you are reflecting back something about their own experience in your writing, those that will all be immediately interesting to the reader. And here again, it is that about that journey of discovery that you as the writer are on as you are writing your own essay. And then the reader will go on that journey with you as well. Conflict, tension, stakes. If you were writing a fictional story, you would ask yourself, what are the stakes in this story for my main characters? And similarly, in creative nonfiction, in personal essay, the question is, what are the stakes for me as the first person narrator? What do I stand to lose? What do I risk by telling this story, by writing this essay? Often the risk is exposure, exposing to the reader some private preoccupation, some obsession, some part of my history when I didn't act so well. And so you want to ask yourself, what in the narrative is personal? Where am I in the essay? What am I willing to reveal about my history, my obsessions, my own failings, my own embarrassments? When I tell you that an essay is about complicated grief, or feeling like an outsider, or contending with the long-term effects of an assault, you can already feel the tension, right? You can you're leaning in because you know that's interesting. And so similarly, my advice is to find a subject that is difficult and personally hurts you, and then wrestle that out on the page. I don't know how many of you read the Modern Love column in the New York Times. It's been running for, I think, a couple of decades, if not more now. And in the column, readers write in their own stories about love. about romantic love, about parents, about children, about neighbors, about friendship. And these essays are always absolutely riveting because in it, writers are just being so vulnerable and remarkably candid about their relationships. I think it's really interesting to hear what the Times has to say about it. They say that the column isn't just about love or relationships, but that they are specifically about feelings, betrayals, and revelations. And when I sort of saw this from the Times, I think it was like in an interview with the Modern Love column editor. When I saw them say this, I thought, oh, okay, that's a good checklist for creative nonfiction, right? If you feel that a piece of writing that you are working on is falling flat, or you're sending it around and you're getting a lot of rejection, ask yourself, are the emotions on the page? Is my vulnerability on the page? Have I been vulnerable? And are there revelations? Are there things that I am discovering? Am I taking the reader on a journey of discovery? So at Riddle Fence, we are especially interested in personal narratives that grapple with something complicated. And there are really three parts to that. The first is narrative, that story forward momentum. That is that strong writing, which is alive on the page. I think for me, alive often means movement, means change, means that story forward piece. And then the second thing is the grappling. There's some complicated business that the writer is working through. And I'm always really interested in seeing that because that grappling, again, is movement on the page, right? There's like friction, there's tension, and that is what makes the writing feel alive. But also, if the writer is working through this complicated business, then we are almost guaranteed that we are going to be going on that journey of discovery with them. And more often than not, the first person is really important, that I perspective. Oftentimes, creative nonfiction essays that I see in the submissions, but also that I see kind of out in the world published, will be told in a second person perspective. So you instead of I. And those can be really strong because they seem to implicate the reader. It's almost like the reader is like pulled in to the page and brought along on this journey. But sometimes I wonder if writers are uh, leaning on the you because they're trying to hide behind the you because something about saying I and me feels more vulnerable than they can really cope with. So if you are writing a second person essay, my advice is that at some point in the revision process, see what would happen, just as an exercise, see what would happen if you switched the second person to the first person. Because maybe you'll find something there. Maybe you'll find that actually the writing becomes more alive. That's just a guideline. It's not a rule. Okay, so the most difficult part, I think, of the process of writing a narrative essay is nailing down what it is specifically that you are writing about. Answering the question, what is your essay about? That question seems really simple, but I think that's a deceptive thing. Because actually, if you sit down and try to nail it down, specifically, what is this essay about, one sentence, this is very difficult to answer. And so for this reason, we're going to spend a little time working on moving from abstract to specific, from an amorphous general idea of what you want to write about to the highly specific thing that you are going to write about in these 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, 5,000 words. And one way to do that is to really drill down by asking yourself, really interrogating yourself with questions like what, and so what, and why. For example, let's say I want to write an essay about my childhood and specifically an early memory. Okay, which one? Be more specific. Which memory? Let's say I want to write about the time I had a big fight with my best friend when we were both 7. Okay, so that is a very specific anecdote. Remember, the anecdotal is a very specific anecdote. And there is potential here that it will be interesting because there is a fight. So it's already, there's some friction there, right? So it's a good start, but I'm going to grill myself a little more and ask myself why. Why this friend? Why this particular fight? I'm sure we had others, but so why this particular one? Well, the truth is, this fight looms large in my memory because after this fight, I never saw this friend ever again. And in fact, I knew this was the last time we were going to see each other because I knew that my parents and I were moving from one country to another. So now it's interesting, right? And now there you can sense there's something more going on there. Okay. So now that we've done that, we're going to have our first writing exercise. I'm going to turn off my camera and we are all going to, and I'm going to time us. We're going to take 5 minutes and I would like you all to write a list of things that you would like to write about. Just, it's very loose. It's just a brainstorming exercise. And I recommend using pencil or pen and paper. There's something about the tactile motion of writing with your hand and something about that brain and hand connection, I think, that makes you more open and more creative and more likely to jot something down without the other part of your brain coming in and saying, oh, that's stupid. Um, okay, so, but that's a guideline, not a rule. So if you want to use your tablet or your computer and your phone, it's totally fine. All right, I'm going to turn my camera off and I'm going to start the timer. And good luck. Go. Okay, that's time. So these are some of the questions you want to ask yourself as you're sort of teasing out you're teasing out the subject that you want to write about and trying to work toward really highly specific. Um, Maybe it's time to then move on to our next exercise, which is just going to be actually just drilling down more on those lists that you began writing. Or if you feel that those lists are already pretty specific, if you feel like your lists are already specific, then you can add more to them. So I'm going to set the timer again and turn off my camera for another 5 minutes. And if it would help, I will bring it back to this. So look at the list that you've made and ask yourselves, what about that? Why? What hurts? Is it vulnerable? And if you, with your lists, are already where Lori is with hers, with that subject, maybe try to think about where would you begin? What's the specific moment or the specific day or the specific scene that you would begin your essay on? Okay, timer begins now. Good luck. Okay, that's time. Um, all right, that's time. I'm gonna move on. Okay, so let's say that, make this smaller. Let's say I wanted to write an essay about my trip to India, the first time I went there. It was a really fun trip, and it was like, I don't know, many weeks long. But imagine I wrote an essay about the whole trip. It would be like making you sit and look through all of my hundreds and hundreds of photos. And as you can see, I'm not a great photographer, so the whole thing would be incredibly boring. Instead, what if I wrote an essay about the afternoon that I took the ferry from Mumbai to this island of cave temples? So now we're getting more specific, right? I could write vivid descriptions of scenery and setting. I could write about my feelings of awe about this UNESCO World Heritage Site and seeing these carvings that were made, hundreds of thousands of years ago. I could do that for 3,000 words, and I guarantee that no matter how beautiful I made my writing, you would fall asleep on page two. Because so what? What is so interesting about that? Why should anyone care? How is this different from a tourism brochure? Well, what if I told you there were vicious monkeys on this island? Monkeys who do not fear humans and who will clamber up your body and grab the chocolate bar right out of your mouth. I could write an essay about arriving on the island, seeing the warnings, and then going about my way, looking at the temples and the carvings as the monkeys were in the trees or on the wall or running around playing. I could write about their dexterous fingers. I could write about the intense heat, the sun, the polluted air, all of which parches the throat. I could write about being really thirsty and pulling a water bottle out of my bag, taking a swig, and being immediately surrounded by a gang of monkeys, a crowd of them closing in, and other tourists hurriedly backing away. So now there's conflict, right? Now there's tension. Now there are some stakes, at least. Um, and I could tell you about how people were yelling at me to throw my water bottles and let the monkeys have it. But how I was so thirsty and I only had this one bottle of water and nothing else. And, it was going to be a couple of hours before the ferry came back to us. And there's no water fountains here. And I could tell you about how my thirst was battling my fear and also my embarrassment, that mortifying feeling of being the center of attention, as being on display, and also my resentment of these monkeys who wanted my water. Okay, so all of that again, there's vulnerability and there is tension and there's conflict and there's some drama. And I could write it in a way where you really, as the reader, felt the experience. And yet, if I'm being honest as a writer and I'm asking myself, is this the true, is this the true depth of the vulnerability I can offer? Isn't there something more I can say? Well, to be perfectly honest, this trip has been more difficult than I have been letting on so far. Actually, I'm exhausted. Actually, I'm jet lagged. Actually, I'm really annoyed because I have culture shock. So you can hear there, right, how the emotional tenor has changed now. It's not just me against the monkeys, it's also me against the place, me feeling at odds with the people. So now there's more there. And now I think the reader really wants to know what is going to happen next. So I could write, the other thing I could do is write a version of the narrative where I don't mention the monkeys at all. I could write an essay where I gloss over the monkeys and make them a footnote, tell this whole story about um, this incredible site I went to go see and how lucky I was to go and see it and how beautiful it was and how the day was sunny and the weather was perfect, right? That's a pretty dishonest version of the story, although not totally dishonest. I mean, there is some honesty there as well, but you see that that's a truncated version of the story. And then I could make the monkeys a footnote and say, oh, and by the way, there were also these monkeys who bullied me into giving them my water bottle. That would not be very interesting. And I think the reader would feel rightly that they had been cheated of the real story, that they had read all these words and not been told the truth. A better way is to look those monkeys and all the conflicting feelings they brought up in that moment right in the eye and write that version of the narrative. So you got to ask yourself, what is stopping you from writing your monkey essay? Because the thing about creative nonfiction is that you have to be raw and vulnerable on the page. And that is especially true if you want to write something that is longer than 500 words. If I wanted to write 500 words or 300 words, I could probably get away with telling a story about these caves where I don't say anything about my own complicated feelings about this trip in this moment, right? I could do that for 300 words and I could probably get away with it. But if I was going to write anything longer than 1,000 words, I would have to be much more honest. There is a monster lurking in every writer's basement. And our job in writing is to bravely venture down there and face the beast down. Because the reader will sense that there is a beast, and the reader will be interested in the monster. Because monsters are compelling, they're gripping, they're entertaining, even when they are dark. Even when you are writing about the darkest moment of your life, if you are doing it in a way that is honest and vulnerable, and you're really grappling with that, the reader is going to go with you for that journey, even if it is a sad journey, even if it brings up, even and especially if it brings up their own complicated feelings about the time they felt something similar or were in a similar situation. It's interesting that Laurie very bravely brought up writing about a death because at Riddle Fence, we get a lot of essays about death. A father's death, an uncle's death, a partner's death, a child's death. Writers are drawn to writing about what is arguably the most difficult aspect of their life, losing a loved one. And yet so many of the essays that we read as totally dispassionate, or else they aren't engaging with what is truly difficult in the experience of losing that loved one. For example, what happens when the grief is complicated by guilt? Or what happens when you feel very alone in your grief and you try to share it or have a moment of recognition from a stranger, and then that stranger shuts you down? Or what happens when your parent dies, but you are estranged from them, and so you don't find out about it until later? There's a real reluctance to tackle that monster in the basement. And even when writers in are trying their best to be vulnerable and raw, and they go in there thinking, consciously thinking, I am really going to do this, somehow still their subconscious, their unconscious kicks in and puts up all these blocks, right? And I think we all have this problem of where we, without even realizing it, skirt around the monster or avoid the monster. Maybe we even go into the basement, but we turn our back on the monster and write looking the other way. And so I think it would be helpful to talk about some of the tactics that we use to avoid the monster. And hopefully by doing this, when you are, if I do this for you now, if I have this list for you now, hopefully when you are writing or revising your own work, you will notice times when you have avoided the beast. One of the really common things that happens is, and I do this as well, is the narrator becomes absent. So ask yourself, where is the I? Am I present in this narrative? Even if you are using the second person, the you perspective, and sometimes you can be using that you where you are in the narrative, you are interrogating another character, even one who isn't there. That's the you. But what I mean by second person you is when there is no I and the I is actually the you. The whole essay is written you. Even when you're doing that, ask yourself, is the you present? Is the first person present? Is the second person present? Or have they disappeared for big chunks of the narrative? Because that is something that happens. The narrative gets tricky. We start grappling with the complicated thing, and then the narrator like disappears out of the scene for long stretches. When that's happening, often what that means is that you are avoiding the monster. So be aware of that. Another thing that happens often is that we rely on the quotes of others. So it's relatively easy to quote Soren Kierkegaard or Emily Dickinson, right? That's pretty easy. What's more difficult is to put grief into your own words or put conflict into your own words or put um, this ambiguous, difficult feeling that you have into your own words. And so sometimes, quoting other voices, bringing other voices into your essay can make the essay incredibly rich and textured and interesting. But just ask yourself, how much are you relying on someone else's words versus finding your own? And it can be helpful if there is a lot of quotes to actually go through and highlight, just as you can go through and highlight where is the narrator, where have I as the narrator disappeared. You can also highlight in one color, how many times, in one color, highlight all the times you have quoted someone else. And that can be a really visual way to see where you are leaning on somebody else instead of putting forth your own ideas. Remember that strong writing is about that journey of discovery, but it has to be your journey of discovery, not someone else's journey of discovery. Also, pay attention to moments where you use vague or abstract statements. Anytime the prose gets vague or abstract or very general, it can be a sign that you're reluctant to face down the monster. Try to be really specific, really interrogate yourself and your ideas. Again, writing cannot be alive on the page if it is full of vague abstractions. Vague abstractions really kill writing. And then the other thing is, it's difficult to have a journey of discovery where you are having these incredible insights if you are speaking in vague abstractions. Are you skirting around a tricky moment? You know, I mentioned before that those monkeys, if I mention those monkeys as a footnote at the end, that would be a real glossing over of the really interesting stuff, right? And the reader would rightly feel that that I had been cheap with them, that I hadn't given them their money's worth. So, are you glossing over the monster or are you making the monster central to the work? Are you writing with the monster? One thing that I notice a lot of, because we do get a lot of submissions about grief and the loss of a loved one, is that sometimes in the work, strangely, the person who is lost, you know, the recently deceased person, is a cipher in the work. I finished reading the piece and I know nothing about them. And that makes it difficult. Like they have to kind of come alive on the page, right? They have to be present in the story. But sometimes, for completely understandable reasons, it's really painful to bring your loved one back to life, to remember how they were, to really dwell on what they smelled like or what the touch of their hand felt like. Like that can be so difficult. But that there is the monster. That difficulty is the monster. But if you don't do that work, then you've taken them out of the story. You have made them vague and an abstraction. And and that's doing them a disservice, and it's also doing the reader a disservice. So facts are really useful, and it can be very helpful when you're, for example, let's say you're writing an essay about grief and the loss of a mother. It can be really helpful to step away and to do a bunch of reading and then to bring some of those findings to the page. But pay attention to how much you are leaning on fact and uh, if it is a way of avoiding the other thing, which is the feelings. Um, you Again, it is that journey of discovery, right? And so the facts that you have learned, the information that you have learned about the grieving process or about the cancer that took your loved one or whatever it is can be really helpful and can add a lot of texture again and depth. And it can be part of that journey of discovery, but it shouldn't be at the expense of the personal, right? The personal and the experiential, those. Remember at the beginning, anecdotal, personal, experiential. You don't want to lean on too many facts so that you are blocking out the reader's experience of your personal journey. What are you not saying? What would be difficult or hard to write about? What specifically, right? So if you are thinking about the big fight you had that ended your long-term relationship. That is, of course, it might seem like, oh, of course, I am now facing this monster down, but just drill down a little more. What would actually be the difficult thing to write about in there? What memory makes you squirm? What makes you want to cover your face and hide? That is the thing that you need to write. Okay, next exercise. And this one is a sneaky little exercise. I would like everyone to write a list of things you do not want to write about. Um, and we're going to take 5 minutes to do this. A list of things that you do not want to write about. I will turn my Hey, that's time. I'm not going to ask anyone to share from this list. Um, but what would be helpful now is if you looked at your two lists, the list of things you would like to write about and the list of things you don't, and see if there are any overlaps, things that from list A that could fit really nicely in an essay with list B. So, for example, if one of the things on the list of things I would like to write about is home, and specifically community, and specifically the community that I have built since I moved to St. John's in my 30s. So, we're talking about friendship now. If that is something general that I would like to write about, of course, I would have to make it more specific. But let's say then on the list of things I don't want to write about is microaggressions. All the times someone has said something low-key racist to me or in my presence, and I have ignored it or told myself I didn't quite hear it. If that's something that I really don't want to write about, you can see how those two things could fit together really nicely in a complicated essay. And again, I would have to like drill down more on both of those things, making them both much more specific. But once I have those two specific nubs, I could put them together in an essay. So this is one thing you could do when you're brainstorming and trying to figure out exactly what your essay is about. You can make these kinds of lists. We're just over an hour in, and I think it's a good time to take a break. So perhaps, though, we're going to take a 5-minute break. It's almost 2:10, so we'll come back at 2:15. But while you're having a break, what would be good is if you gave a little bit of thought to one of the things on your do not want to write about list, just one thing. And again, if you can pair it up with something from the other list, that's good too. But just kind of ruminate a little bit about the thing that you don't want to write about for 5 minutes. And then I will see everyone again at 2:15. Sound good? All right. Okay, that is time. Um, so it's 2:15. Welcome back. So you've all hopefully been thinking about that subject you chose, the one that you don't want to write about, the monster in the basement. So guess what? I'm very mean because the next exercise is we're going to free write for 20 minutes about that subject. Um, I'm not going to ask anyone to share. There won't be time to share afterward. So you should feel free that this will absolutely just be between you and the page. We are all at home, so no one is going to see it. And maybe what you write will go straight in the bin after this workshop, or maybe it will be the beginning of an essay that wins awards. Who knows? So I will set a timer, and if everyone could write about the thing that they do not want to write about, that would be great. And again, I really highly recommend doing this by hand. And if you are writing by hand, try to keep your hand moving even when you hit a block, even when you hit a roadblock and you don't know what to do. You can just doodle in the margins. Or another thing that can be really helpful actually is just to write a list of words that come to you while you aren't sure. Because sometimes what happens is a word will come to you and you'll be like, oh yeah, that's triggering something else. And that'll get you kind of out of that block. Okay, so 20 minutes and time begins now. Okay, and that's time. All right, so we're just getting too close to the end of the workshop, and I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about revising. Because when you are first drafting, the best way to do it is to turn off the critical part of your brain and just write with as much freedom and abandon and vulnerability as you can. But then once you have a finished draft, then you really want to turn the critical brain back on, and you want to go through that draft with a lot of intentionality and curiosity. Um, and so the first thing, if I can just give you a few first steps, the first thing you should really do is to think about on that first pass, you are not trying to perfect every word. The goal is to search for an answer to the question. Remember that question from the start. What is this essay about? Because by the end, when you've done revising, you should be able to summarize the essay into a single sentence. You might not know what the essay is about right away. It might be something you discover over the course of not just drafting, but revisions. Um, but one thing you can do is look for, are there questions that you have written in your draft? Highlight them. If there are a lot of questions, then those are all strong signposts pointing you to the fact that you haven't quite figured out the answer to the question yet. But one thing you can do that can be really helpful is to make a list of all your questions and then try to answer as many as possible. And in answering them, I think it will lead you closer to the real truth of what the essay is about. But sometimes it can really take a good deal of exploratory writing, wandering around from anecdote to anecdote, from subject to subject to figure out what is the narrative you really need to tell. So give yourself a lot of grace because personal writing is not easy and it's really common to draft a lot of material that gets cut. Even if I was to say, I am going to write this essay about the time I was 7 and I had a fight with my best friend and then I never saw her again. Even if I was to tell you that, it is still not the true answer to the question, what is the essay about? There is still something more that needs to get discovered there. So it can take many drafts, but if you can, in that first passive revision, if you can try to get a little closer to answering this question, that's really going to help you. And then find the real beginning. Often the first page or two, the first paragraph or two is just throat clearing. So search your essay for the true beginning. It's the moment where the story gets really good, where it becomes interesting, where the narrative becomes irresistible. For example, those monkeys in India. I could begin the story on the plane, right, where I didn't sleep a wink. I could begin the story at the airport, where jet lag and confused, I tried to make my way through the rigmarole of customs and baggage claim and trying to find a cab in a foreign country at 2 a.m. Or I could begin on the ferry, leaving the mainland and going to this island, seeing India Gate and all the crowds there get smaller and smaller. Or I could begin with that green sign, that beware of monkeys sign. Doesn't that sound like a much stronger beginning? Remember foreshadowing? It foreshadows what's to come. And then there are other tools that I have in my tool belt, right? There's time travel, and I can use flashbacks later in the narrative to flash back to the sleepless night I've had on the plane, or the confusion I felt, or all the kind of this sort of confusion and difficulty I had at the airport, or the cab ride where we got lost and I didn't know how to explain because there was um, there were language barriers. I could use flashback to reveal all of that. So you don't have to tell the story in chronological order. This is where it's different from a journal entry, right? You're taking the journal entry and you're crafting it into a narrative essay. And then step three, where am I? Where is the first person narrator? Remember, you're not Nick Carraway writing a story about Gatsby. You are the hero of the story. You're the main character. It's you. So don't get lost. So, let's say I am writing that essay about that fight I had with my friend when we were 7. So at the time, this was in Dubai, where I lived for the first 7 years of my life. There were these plastic eggs that were kind of all the rage at the time. You could get them in a vending machine. You could like put your coin in, and an egg came out, and then we would twist the parts of the egg off, the two sides off, and inside there would be a toy. And my friends and I didn't really care about the toys. We cared about the eggs, and we were all about collecting the eggs. And certain colors were rarer than others, and so more highly prized. So I went to this play date and I brought my eggs, and my friend had her eggs. And so yeah, let's say I describe Nishreen, my friend, character, her bedroom, setting, the eggs themselves, the games we invented, and how we played them. And let's say I said, oh, and then we had a fight right before I left. And let's say I described how she snatched the eggs that she claimed were hers and how insistent she was, and maybe the tears in her eyes. And let's say I described how our mothers ran in to intervene, and they tried, and like you know, the kind of negotiations they tried to create, where they tried to say, well, what if we just put all these eggs in a hat and you both chose? I'm painting that whole scene, and I'm painting everyone in it, except who's missing here? I haven't really said anything about myself, right? I have disappeared. And this is like a good example of how, even unintentionally, we can skirt around that monster in the basement. We can absent ourselves from him. To tell the story properly, I have to center myself, the me, the first person in the narrative. What did I feel? What did I think? What was my role in this fight? And it's in asking those questions and really forcing myself to sit there and recall all of this and be honest and vulnerable that it comes out. The truth is, I instigated that fight. I knew I was claiming ownership over eggs that did not belong to me. I knew when my friend was crying that she was right and that I was the bad guy. So you can hear how the story got much more interesting, right? After I centered myself, that's what you want to do. And then, of course, you want to probe deeper, right? Why would I start a fight with my best friend? The last time we saw each other, I knew I was leaving. I knew my family and I were going, across the ocean to the other side of the world, that we were coming to Canada. So why would I, in this last play date, instigate this fight? So now this is the journey of discovery, right? It's one thing, and it's well and good to bring the story to life with vivid writing that jumps off the page. But that journey of discovery only happens when I center myself in the narrative and I really put myself in the hot seat. So the truth is, I picked that fight because I was going to miss my friend, right? This is what I can tell you now with the benefit of hindsight, is that on some level, I didn't want to end that friendship on a sad note, and I would rather have ended it on a sour, angry note. I was leaning on anger because I couldn't sit in my grief. That's the kind of insight, right, that makes the story really compelling. And that's the kind of insight, too, where even though it's a very particular story, it's very specific to me, very likely a reader will see themselves reflected. I already talked a little bit about quotations and the importance of not leaning too hard on other people's words, because the strongest, most interesting insights are going to come when you plumb your own depths. I could certainly do a lot of reading about friendship, the psychology of fighting, and I could bring quotes from scholars and poets into the work, and that would be fine. But if that's all you got by way of insight and that journey of discovery, that would be pretty boring. It's only interesting if it's personal, if I bring it back to me, if I tell you that I really liked this friend, that I really loved all of my friends, that I loved my school, I loved my life in the only place I had ever called home. And actually, I was acting pretty blasé about this huge move to another country, even though I was terrified. And that blaseness that I was enacting was the same blaseness that my parents were enacting at home. We were just going and no reasons were given. And as a child, I had very little agency over anything, except that I could start a fight with my friend and I could control how that friendship ended and the terms of that ending. And that's really what I was doing. You can see how much more interesting that got, right? Sometimes the monster is in the mirror, and that is what we have to face down. Okay, step 5. Ooh, uh, length and word count. So let's go back to those monkeys in Mumbai, right? I could tell you the story like this. I saw the warning sign. I wandered through the caves. I was really thirsty. I pulled out the water bottle. The monkeys circled. I twisted off the cap. The monkeys began closing in. Other tourists scampered. I lifted the bottle to take a sip. The monkeys came closer. People yelled at me to throw my water bottle. I held my ground, uncertain. And then, and then, and then, and then. That can be a taut narrative full of drama, maybe even emotion, evocative description. But it would still ring hollow. If you want to write the kind of messiness, the kind of essay that sticks to the reader's bones, one that resonates even after they have finished, there has to be more than actions and drama. You're going to need that voyage of discovery. What lesson did I learn from these monkeys? What did that event reveal to me? What do I understand about myself in hindsight? Maybe that incident with the monkeys is part of a pattern of behavior. Maybe it says something about how I approach the world, incautiously, heedless of warnings, perhaps a little arrogant, believing that nothing bad will ever happen. When else has this pattern revealed itself in my life? Is there another specific incident, perhaps one that ended badly? And could I take both things and weave them into a narrative? If I can do that, then the essay has earned a longer word count, right? I can maybe make that stretch for 3,000 words. But I could also write an engaging, funny version of the story that isn't so deep, maybe doesn't even have too much insight, too much of a voyage of discovery. But if I keep it to 500 or even 750 words, maybe 1,000 words, it could still be enough. So part of revising is really pinning down how many words the story has earned. And just because a publication has a word maximum of 3,000 words or 5,000 words, or they say their word count is unlimited, doesn't mean that you should use up all those words. You really want to think about what is the breadth and depth of the story that you are telling, of the narrative that you are unfurling, and how many words do you truly need. Okay, we are at 10 minutes to 3. And so I'm gonna switch now. I'm actually gonna stop sharing the screen and we can do questions if anyone has any. Oh,
Hi there. I'm
hi,
going to
who's that?
read questions
Oh, it's
just
Elizabeth.
so we
Great,
can make things easier. um,
great.
Sharon, that was amazing. That was so good.
Oh,
And
thanks.
I didn't see the monkey story coming at all, actually. So that was super exciting. But let's get to these questions. If you have questions, if you've been harboring questions, throw them in the chat, and we'll try to get to them all. The first one we had was I just had that disappear somehow. How did that happen?
I
Hold on
did
a
see that
second.
someone asked what
Yes,
was
there we go.
step 4.
Okay. how do you, this is such a good question. How do
Oh.
you distinguish between a subject, monster, that would be worth digging into and eventually publishing versus something that you should maybe just parse out with a therapist?
Oh, that's good question. Um, Everyone has to make their own call on that, but my feeling is if you're telling the therapist, you should tell the reader. Is that bad advice? The thing is, you can write an essay and you don't have to send it out, right? So I think writing can be incredibly helpful way of digging into your own emotions. And I sometimes think when you work with editors, it can feel if they're doing their job really well that they are therapists for the work. And so when the work is nonfiction, then they almost become therapists for you in some way. What you think working with editors? Yeah, I would say I guess the only thing there is maybe with ethics, and who the other quote unquote characters are and what you are saying about them in the work that can maybe uh, make you draw the line between something that you keep in your journal or keep for yourself versus or talk to with a therapist versus actually publishing. But I think the other thing is that when you're working with a therapist, it's not really coherent, right? You're not crafting a narrative in an intentional way, not if you're doing it properly. I don't really know much about therapy. I probably shouldn't talk about therapy, but the work of creative nonfiction and writing is really that careful crafting of the narrative. And you are picking and choosing what to put on the page and what to keep off. And I think that's quite different than the work that you do in therapy. So maybe the answer is actually that if you are reworking if you are creating an essay, a narrative essay that is also grappling with complicated things that you are also working through with your therapist, really those two things are two separate projects. And the thing that you are publishing is quite different from the full scope of what you and your therapist are working through together. And when you're working with your therapist, you are not using these creative tools of time travel and character and dialogue, right? Those are in some way when we're bringing anything to the page, even if it's nonfiction, there is a kind of artificiality to that I think you don't want in therapy. And then you don't want the kind of emotional and fulsome kind of oh, sorry for this language, but like the barfing, right? The like verbal diarrhea of it all that can happen in therapy. That's not what you want with creative nonfiction. You want something much more carefully constructed to be that voice. So the voyage of discovery, probably a lot of those insights that you will have maybe gained from therapy, but the way you take all of that and fashion it into a piece, that is the difference. Does that sound like it answers the question? It was a really good
Yeah,
question.
it was a good question. A second question we have is I can clearly see the avoidance. I sometimes practice in my own writing, so I value what we're practicing here, but I can also see two potential problems that at one extreme, our writing becomes a kind of confessional, or at the other end,
Mhm.
that we leave nothing unsaid. I took a workshop with Betsy Warland, who talked about the importance of leaving some things unsaid. I suppose that means the reader infers to some degree and doesn't need to be told what we're feeling all the time.
Yeah, I think this is a little bit adjacent to the first question, right? It isn't a full confessional. Like your journal entry, the conversations you have with your therapist are full confessionals. Whereas the creative nonfiction, the narrative essay is not a full confessional. It is again a constructed version. And like if you think about memoir, if you think about the best memoirs, they are not a writer's whole life. They are a very specific, they are looking at it through a very specific lens. And so for example, if it's a memoir of childhood, doesn't necessarily mean that the characters or the narrator's siblings will all be fully fleshed out or come to life. They might be kind of shadowy and in the background. They might be a little bit ciphers, right? Because that's on purpose, because you are leaving something out and let the reader infer what they want.
The
But
next
that doesn't
question,
necessarily mean that you're avoiding the monster. That doesn't necessarily mean you're avoiding the monster, right? You can like leave things out while still facing that monster down.
the next question is again, I think, adjacent to
Okay.
these two. Again, a really good question. Any tips on how we can engage in life writing that might involve someone people know or could identify easily? How do you write truthful and vulnerable personal essays about experiences that involve others without opening yourself up to possible legal implications, for example, slander?
Uh, this is where lawyers come in, right? Oh, sorry. Okay. Can you read that question again? I'm gonna think
Yes.
about it.
Okay, any tips on how we can engage in life writing that it might involve someone else or someone people know and could identify easily? How do you write truthful and vulnerable personal essays about experiences that involve others without opening yourself up to possible legal implications, for example, slander?
Okay, there's kind of two parts to that question, and the second part is legal. And I'll come back to that. I My instinct is that and I'm not the expert on this, but my instinct is that when you are first drafting, don't worry about it. Just draft. And then when you are revising at a certain point, you have to think about these kinds of questions. But actually, I would reframe to think about not the other person, but you, right? The I, the putting yourself in the center and your experience of it. And I think if you focus on the camera on you, focus the writing on you, you might find that actually you don't need too much of the other people. You might not need as much as you think you need. And in that way, you can maintain their anonymity and respect their anonymity. And then the other part of that is that when something is going to be published, particularly in a book, publishers tend to be very careful about this kind of stuff. Um, and from my experience, even writing novels, with both my novels, there have been legal reads where a lawyer gets involved at a stage and goes through and makes sure that there's nothing there that can be brought to court. And so I imagine that is the case with like a longer piece. But yeah, then there are other ways to make somebody anonymous. For example, you don't use their real name. You give them an initial. I know sometimes like with pieces that are published in book form, that sometimes identifiable features of the person will be changed so that actually they become even more anonymous. There's like the kind of a fictionalizing of the character. So there are techniques and tactics. Sorry if you can hear my dog barking. There are techniques and tactics that you can use after the fact, but during the writing process, my advice is to stay close to you. And in doing that, you might find that you can skirt around this.
Excellent. We have one last question, and it's a little bit more general, and a little bit off that adjacent topic. So that's interesting to me. Interested in any thoughts about an object, for example, a prized one, something you've kept almost inexplicably for a long time as a catalyst to a personal essay.
Yeah, that's really great. I love that. Is that the question? That's my
That's the whole
answer. I
question.
love that.
What do you
I
think of
love
that?
that. I guess the journey of discovery there is why. Where did this come from and why? Yeah. What is the meaning behind it? Mm. I think someone did have a question about step 4. It's quotations.
Yeah, that one I think was answered by another
Oh, okay.
participant in the chat.
All right.
Yeah, I thought in that question where the asker says something you've kept almost inexplicably for a long time, we're almost like answering the question right there. The question is,
Yeah.
why have you kept it for so long? Time to
Yeah,
figure that
it's
out, right? Yeah.
that word inexplicable. If something in your life is inexplicable to you, it is demanding you to go on this journey of discovery, and figure it out. Okay, so since we are being honest here, I got to tell you guys that monkey story was invented. And actually, so the India is true, and I really did go to this island, and there was a guy who was drinking water, and we were all running away, yelling, "Throw the water, throw the water." And so the monkey that you see drinking water, that's his water ball. It wasn't mine, but I have always wanted to write a story about him. And when I was thinking about this workshop, I was like, oh my God, I got to use him. So that story is not mine. But the thing about my friend is true. And I didn't actually even put it together that the reason I had started this fight was because of that until I was working on this workshop and I was like grappling with it. I was like, well, is there something more here? And then yeah. And then all that stuff from my childhood came back. So there.
Excellent. Well, on behalf of all the participants and Riddle Fence, Sharon, I want to thank you so much for being here this afternoon. Um, all the participants will get a post workshop questionnaire. Please fill it out for us because we'd love to know what you think and what you're hoping for in future. It also helps us to plan our own events. And coming up next, at the end of April, in 4 weeks' time, there's a poetry workshop with Anna Swanson. And that event is already up on our workshop on our website, and it's up on Eventbrite as well right now. So you can go ahead and register. It is again, pay what you can, funded totally by the Cultural Economic Development Program of the Government of Newfoundland and Labrador. Thanks so much, everyone, for being here. Thank you again, Sharon, so much. Such a
Oh,
great
thank you,
workshop.
everyone. It's really helpful for me to put together as well. And please, the best thing you can do is forget everything I said and read lots of essays. That's like the best thing you can do is just read widely and read like a writer, pay attention to what you like and what you don't like. Both things are instructive. And then ask yourself, what is the writer doing to pull this off, or how have they failed to pull it off? And I think reading widely like a writer will really help you when you're working on your own thing. Particularly if you're reading a work and it's not resonating with you, ask yourself, is there a monster that is being avoided here by this writer? It's much easier for us to see the flaws in other people's work than it is to see it in ourselves. But if we can practice this muscle of really being critical with other people's work, then we can do it with ourselves. That's it.
Great.
That's all I got.
Oh, thanks again. All right. Have a great weekend, everyone. If you are in St. John's like we are, there's sun today. Go outside. You should go outside. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.